So you want to buy a barn find motorcycle. Here's the things that you need to consider before you go out and buy that barn find for a couple $100, and especially if it's your first time getting a motorcycle, you should think twice. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. In today's video, we're going to talk about barn find motorcycles because I know a thing or two about buying a bike that's been sitting for 10, 20, 30 years. There is a whole host of things that you need to think about before going out and buying a bike that's been sitting for a while. If this is your first time ever buying a motorcycle, if you're a complete beginner, I would highly discourage buying one of these bikes, and we'll talk about why. The first thing that you need to consider when going out for a barn find bike is the cost of the motorcycle. And we're not talking about just a couple $100 you're gonna give the guy who has it for sale, but you also need to consider all of the things that are going to take to get this motorcycle running and the time it's going to take to get this bike running. The first thing I always consider is how much is this motorcycle worth running in riding condition in the same cosmetic shape. Perhaps the motorcycle you're looking at is a 4 or 5 out of 10, maybe even a 2 or 3 out of 10, but it's been covered in dust and you think that it might clean up to around a 5. Well, how much does a 5 out of 10 cosmetic condition cost if it was running and riding with a few issues? Even if the bike is in running condition, there's probably going to be a bunch of things you got to take care of. If it's an old bike, the clutch lever might not be adjusted properly, the clutch might be sticking a little bit, the throttle lines might be out, the brakes might be sticking, the brake fluid is probably old, all of the fluid is probably old in the bike, the tires might be shot, the chain might be shot, the sprocket, all of the things I mentioned in the last video of, so you just bought a bike, here's the things you need to do. All of those things are most likely going to be needed to be done on a new bike that you purchased that's 40 years old. A new to you bike, obviously. But when buying a barn find, let's say the bike in running condition you can go buy for $2,500 pretty easily. And if the bike you're buying is $300 but it needs $2,000 to be fixed, well, is it really worth, spending the time on a barn find? If you're spending $2,000 in parts and then you don't even consider your own time into it, you might as well just go out and buy the bike that is already running. So you really need to consider the purchase price of the bike plus the parts plus your time. Obviously, you're not going to pay yourself shop time, but if you were to take it to a shop, consider how much it's going to cost. I like to divide it by half because, it's more of a fun tinker thing at the end of the day for most people. But you still got to consider a little bit of your time and see if it's worth doing, because otherwise what's the point of doing it in the first place, especially if you're trying to fix it, maybe ride a little bit and then sell it. And even if you're trying to just fix it and ride it, again, what's the point if you can go out and buy the same bike in running condition for how much you're going to be into it for? There's a whole bunch of other variables like collectability and all of that you got to consider. But if this is your first time buying a barn find, you don't need to consider that. Just consider the cost of the bike, how much it's going to cost to repair, and how much you can get a clean one for. That's the first things that I would do. Most likely if you're watching this video, you're looking at a 70s bikes, perhaps an early 80s bikes. If you're looking at later 80s, 90s bikes, or even some early 2000s bikes, there's way more things you have to consider, which I'll touch on in a second. But let's say you're looking at a 70s bikes. Here's the things that I automatically assume are wrong with the bike. It's going to need its carburetors cleaned, it's going to need tires, it's going to need its brakes done. A 70s bike will most likely have a single disc in the front and a drum in the rear, and will have a cable clutch. You might have to replace the throttle cables and maybe the clutch cable depending on how bad the bike is, but I've seen bikes in really bad conditions, so unless it's snapped, you should be fine to just get it running. But you're going to have to change all of the fluids. You're going to have to rebuild the clutch master cylinder, I would say 9 out of 10 times. Probably 10 out of 10 times it's been sitting for longer than 10 years, especially if it doesn't have fluid in it. You're going to have to get a new brake line, and you're going to have to rebuild the caliper, and you might as well put pads in it because, well, they're probably a little worn out. Depending on how many miles the bike has, of course. And the carbs are a big thing, especially if you're buying like a CB750, because it has 4 carburetors, so all of that needs to be taken apart, all of them need to be cleaned, the jets need to be replaced or thoroughly cleaned and put back together. Tires also are a big factor into it, so those are the big 3 that I like to consider. And all of these things are after you've done the inspection, and I've made videos on inspections in the past of what to look out for and certain things that you should be doing. I'll link a couple of videos down below that highlight all of the other things that I'm talking about in this video. If you're buying an 80s bikes, another big thing of these motorcycles, including all of that, is CDI boxes. These bikes now have CDIs. CDIs can be a little finicky depending on certain models. I've had some bad experiences with CDIs going bad. The CDI boxes will cost a couple $100, but sometimes you're gambling on the box and you might have to buy one or two of them in order to get the right one and a working one, especially if you're buying used parts, because from what I believe, none of the models that I've had that I've looked out for seem to have new CDI boxes just available. You can repair some CDIs, but it might be easier to replace it in your case. It's just another variable that I like to kind of consider before I purchase a bike. It's not a make or break. The older bikes have points and most of the time you can clean them, so there's not really a cost into that. Not really a cost into carb cleaning either, but it's a bigger service that requires a decent amount of labor. These bikes will also have rear disc brakes, and they may even have dual front disc brakes, which just ups the price more and more of the small things that you gotta buy. Another thing that was implemented in the 80s was hydraulic clutches. I don't know when the first hydraulic clutch was put on a motorcycle, but it became commonly used in the 80s. If the motorcycle's been sitting for a few years, the clutch master cylinder is probably going to be bad. You're probably going to have to rebuild the top master cylinder and replace all of those lines. Rebuilding is probably just a bare minimum, but from my experience working on some 90s bikes, you're gonna have to replace the lines. Getting into the late 80s and 90s, there's a whole lot that goes into this. Some bikes had ABS, most of them started to implement fuel injection, and that just starts to make the prices go crazy. Restoring the Ducati that I'm currently doing, that bike has been the most costly bike to get up and running because there's so many moving parts. All of the things mentioned before, tires, brakes, carburetors are no longer a thing, but now you have fuel pumps, fuel injectors, throttle bodies, and all of the stuff that goes along with that. These early days of fuel injection were not implemented in the best ways, so the fuel pump isn't in the best location. So servicing those things is a little bit more annoying than some of the newer bikes and some of the earlier bikes. Now, we've spent a long time on cost factor because at the end of the day, when you're restoring a barn find, that is a big, major key player in the thing you should know and all of the things that you need to encapsulate inside of it. The next thing you need to know, if you're not doing a frame-off build, if you're not doing a frame-off restoration of some kind, you're going to have things that are going to continuously go wrong with the bike. Now, you might get lucky and you might have an older Honda that you fix up one time, you put all the parts on it, and it just goes. But chances are the motorcycle that has been sitting for a few years is going to need to be continuously dialed in for a couple of miles while you ride it. You might think you're all good after the first one-time cleanup, you ride it, and then you might have some other issues come up. There's some bikes, mainly older Hondas. Older Hondas are just some of the best motorcycles that have ever been produced. I have a very strong love for these bikes, and there's a reason why. You can park them in a corner for ages, and if you clean the carbs properly, I mean, you might be able to get lucky and just kick it a few times and it starts running. Other manufacturers did a lot of weird things, and there's things that are going to break and go wrong. Even in Hondas, there's things that still can and will go wrong. So that's something you need to be aware of. And that's the reason why I don't recommend it for a first-time rider. First-time rider, if you're just trying to get out and enjoy a bike, and then you buy a barn find that you think you're going to do over winter, in springtime, instead of riding the motorcycle, you're going to spend time tinkering on the bike and trying to dial it in, while you could be putting on miles and getting the experience. As a second bike, a barn find is a great option, but I highly recommend if you're planning on riding seriously, and especially if you're a first-time rider, you have another bike that is ready turnkey that you can just get out and put miles on. Cost factor is a major thing when you're looking into getting a barn find motorcycle. In some instances, it might be better to go out and buy a bike that's already fixed, especially if you're someone who's not incredibly mechanically inclined. Now, for me, I love fixing these bikes, reviving them. Motorcycles like my Triumph Bonneville, I brought that bike back to life after what seemed like a decade or so. I got the bike running, I rode it a few times, it still needs a whole host of things, and well, I have a little too many projects right now, and hopefully we'll turn that around in the not too distant future. If you guys are wondering where some of my barn find updates are, well, there's a lot of bikes that I've been working on, and a couple of unfortunate news on some bikes that seemed like the restoration was almost finished. You guys are gonna have to wait, stick around, and subscribe to the channel to find out what's happening with those. Also, thank you to everyone who has already picked up a house t-shirt from the Vintage Racing Club. If you guys are interested in supporting the channel and all the things we do on here, not only do we have a podcast going up on the Vintage Racing Club studio channel, but we also have our house tees officially live, and I'll leave that first link in the description down below. I wish you luck with your barn finds because, well, you're going to have a lot of work ahead of you, and hopefully it goes smoothly and you have a fun time doing it, and you don't end up financially bankrupting yourself. With that said, that's all I have for the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.